Hello friends, in this lecture we're going to start creating the player. The first step is to create a new C++ class. So let's go into the tools menu up here, click on new class, and from here we're going to pick a parent class. Now the parent class we pick has to be possessible because we want to use this, we want to control this as the player. Here we have two options, a character or a pawn. Both of these are possessible, but the character has a bunch of extra stuff like the character movement component, which is Unreal's built-in movement system. Since in this game the movement we're going to create is going to be extremely simple, we don't need to use Unreal's system because it's going to be a little bit of an overkill. Because of that, I'm not going to use a character and I'm going to make the player a pawn. So let's pick that, click on next. For the name, I'm going to pick player character and click on create class. That is going to create two files for me, playerCharacter.h and playerCharacter.cpp. And Unreal is also going to compile these for me, so let's wait for that to finish. Okay, the compilation is done. Now we can go ahead and start writing some code. If you get this, you can just click on reload all, and that should be fine. I'm quickly gonna get rid of these comments. I don't like them. Just like that. Let's also do the same here in the C++ file. Just like that. If you get these red lines, that's fine. Those are just gonna go away by themselves. As you can see, this is a class that's inheriting from the pawn class. It's called a player character, and in here we simply have some declarations for these functions like begin play tick and setup player input component. We also have the constructor. So nothing much is going on. This is basically an empty class. In this lecture, we're not going to do much. We're simply going to create the components that the player is going to use, and those are going to be a capsule component and a sprite component. So let's go ahead and include the files, the header files. The capsule is going to be components, capsule component.h, and the sprite component is going to be paper sprite component.h. Down here we're going to create the variables for these. These are going to be uProperty, visible anywhere, blueprint, read write. The first one will be the capsule, so that's going to be a uCapsule component pointer. We'll just call this capsule comp, just like that. And then we're going to create a uPaper sprite component pointer, and we'll call this sprite comp. So you probably understand what a capsule component is. It's just a collision shape that we're going to use for collisions. And the sprite component is going to show or display the sprite that we're going to provide to it. So very straightforward. Let's save this, go into the CPP file, and in the constructor, we're going to create these components. To do that, we're going to use the create default subobject function. This will take in the class. For the capsule, it's going to be uCapsule component. And then this is going to take in the name here, which we're going to see in the editor. And for this, we can simply say capsule comp as well. This function is going to return a pointer to the capsule component it creates, and then we're going to save that pointer in the variable we created in the class. Just like that. I want to set the capsule component as the root component. So we're going to call set root component, and we're going to pass the capsule component, just like that. Next up, we're going to create the sprite component, which is going to be very similar. So we'll just change that to be sprite component here and here. And we're also going to change the class name to be a uPaper sprite component. But this time, we're not going to set it to be the root. We're going to attach this to the root. And to do that, we're going to say sprite component setup attachment. and we can say root component here. And by this line, the root component variable, which is a built-in variable, should be the capsule component because we're making this call up here. Awesome. So this inside of the constructor is going to create the two components the player needs. And in this lecture, we're not going to do anything else in here in the code, at least. So let's go ahead and exit out of Unreal. Let's also close down this live coding thing. And we're going to right click here, rebuild the project. And after that, we're going to create the blueprint for the player. So the compilation is done. Let's go ahead and create a new blueprint. In the content folder, we're going to right click, create a new folder, and call this blueprints. Inside of this folder, we're going to right click again, click on blueprint class, and from the list, we're going to do a search for player character. This one right here. The name is going to be blueprint underscore player character. Just like that. Let's open it up. Inside of the blueprint, from here, from the components, you can see the capsule component and the sprite component be created inside of the code. And you can also see that the capsule is the root, just like we set this up. First of all, we're going to set up the sprite component. So let's click on that. The source sprite here is going to be blue player sprite. Just like that, as you can see. And currently we're looking at this from a 3D point of view. And to get a 2D point of view of this, we can go into this list here. So if you click on perspective, you have these orthographic points of view. And the one I like to use is the right view. And from this, you can actually see what this is going to look like in the game. And we can also do the same thing from the level as well. Just go into perspective here. Click on right, and when you first do that, it's going to be in the wireframe mode. So you simply have to click on wireframe and then go into lit. And you also want to usually go into show and turn off the grid, but currently it seems to be fine actually. But as you can see now, the grid outside of the background is gone. Okay, so back to the player. In the sprite, we're going to do one more thing, which is going to be setting the collision preset to be no collision, because we don't want the sprite itself to have collision. The collision will be done with the capsule component. And finally, we also want to make sure that the material here is set to be translucent unlit sprite material. In order to see this, you might have to click on this gear here and turn on show plugin content. So make sure that's turned on. And this material will be used so that we can sort the different sprites in the game. I'm going to explain this more in the future, don't worry. Just make sure that it's using this one. Okay, so that's the sprite. Let's also set up the capsule. The capsule has a half height and a radius. The half height is going to be 40. And also the radius is going to be 40, and that's going to create a circle, as you can see. And if you look at this from the perspective, you will see that it turned into a sphere, which is perfect because the player is a circle. So that is exactly what we need. I'm also going to go down into the collision here and set the preset to be a pawn. Okay. So that's all we need to do here for the player character. I'm going to, as the next step, create a game mode so that we can set this player blueprint as the default pawn. So let's go ahead and get rid of this blue player sprite. Let's, inside of the blueprints folder, right click, create a new blueprint class, and this is going to be a game mode base. We'll call this blueprint underscore my game mode. Just like that. Open it up. And the only thing we need to do here is set the default pawn class to be blueprint player character. save, compile, and then we're going to go into the project settings, into maps and modes, and we're going to set the default game mode to be the blueprint my game mode so that we actually use it. Okay, now when we play the game, the player blueprint should be spawned at the player starts position, as you can see. We can click on it from the outliner, and you will also see that the location for this is 0, 0, 0, exactly the same position as the player start. Great, so we have the player in the game, but of course currently it's not doing anything. So the next steps are going to be setting up the input system so that we can interact with the game using the keyboard, and then implementing the movement code in the player class so that we can actually move the player. So those are going to be the next two steps. Before we end this lecture, I want to talk about two more things. The first one is going to be the translucent unlit sprite material. So like I told you, we're going to use that to sort the different sprites we have in the game. So if you click on the background, let's also switch this to use the translucent unlit sprite material. And once you pick this material, you can go down into the rendering section right here. And if you open up the advanced portion here, you will see that there is a translucency sort priority integer here. This determines which sprite is going to get drawn first. Currently, this is set to 0. Let's also take a look at this in the player. So click on the sprite, go down to rendering, click on advanced, and here this is also set to be 0. So for example, if I set this to be -10 and play the game, this time we're not going to see the player, because currently the player is drawn behind the background because of its sort priority being less than the background sort priority. But if I set this to be 10, that's going to be more than 0, and now we're going to see it. So this is the purpose of using this material. And this is one way of ordering our sprites for a 2D game. The other way, I think I mentioned it in the last video, is using the Y position of these sprites. So for example, the background is currently at Y position 0. I can place this at -10, and then I can play the game. And when I do that, you will see that if you eject using this button, or you can also press F8, you will see that, let's see, let's move very slowly. You can actually see that the player sprite is a little bit in front of the background. So this would be the other way of doing the same thing, but I'm mainly going to use the material. So I'm mainly going to put all of these at the same Y position. So let's put the background back at 0, just like that. And the second thing I want to speak about before we end it is the camera's property here called ortho width. So if you currently play the game area here is going to be a certain size. This is the size of the camera size, basically. We can control this using this ortho width variable. This is basically the width of the camera. So we can set the width, and then the height of the camera is going to be automatically calculated using the aspect ratio here. So for example, if I set the width to be 1280, then the height is going to be 1280 divided by the aspect ratio, which is 177777, and that's going to be 720, which is going to be an HD resolution. So that is how the width of the camera works, and I can set this to be something very small, and that's going to make the game area very small, and I can set this to be something large, like 1920, and that's going to make the game area large. So this is going to be important in the future because we're going to use this width of the camera to control how big the game is going to be. And with that, we're going to end the lecture. In this one, we created a new C++ class for the player, which is inheriting from the pawn parent class. Inside of here, we created the components that we need, which is a capsule component and a sprite component. And in the constructor, we're using the create default subobject function to create these components. And we also did the attachments. We're setting the capsule as the root, and then we're attaching the sprite to the root, which is the capsule. Then inside of Unreal, we created a blueprint using this class, and we configured the sprite and the capsule inside of the blueprint. After that, we created a game mode and set the default pawn as the blueprint we created, so that when we play the game, we actually get that blueprint as the player. And finally, we learned about the translucent unlit material and also the ortho width property of the camera. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next part.